So, reading from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 22. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. By faith he still speaks even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father, because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised, they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. What is faith? I guess today we'd say that faith is some sort of mystical something or other that comes to you and you have no control as to whether you have it or not. Faith is not something you have to work at. Faith is wishful thinking, or perhaps believing the impossible. So why is this discussion important? Well, remember, the writer is writing to people who are in danger of turning back. They're facing a persecution for their faith. So why do they and us need it? Well, remember chapter 10, verse 39. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who believe and are saved. It's to ensure that they and us persevere in the gospel. And so we don't shrink back and end up being destroyed by God. And if we go further back in the letter to the Hebrews, back to chapter 6, to verses 11 and 12, we read this. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. See, faith is about making our hope sure and that we will inherit what God has promised. We read in chapter 6, it involves patience and diligence. In other words, it's about forward looking. And it's about work, not laziness. It's going to require hard work. But did you notice, as we read through those verses from chapter 11, that faith is something that's energetic, it's visionary, and it's risky. Think of Abraham. The writer tells us that he left Ur, went to an unknown land, verse 8, when he had nothing else to rely on other than God's word. He didn't know where he was going, but he still went. Look at Abel, verse 4, or Enoch, verse 5, Noah, verse 7. They trusted God's word and acted on it, and so received the promises and blessings God had promised. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not even in this life, but they received the promises and blessings that God had promised. With Abel, if you study Abel carefully, it was about his heart, where his heart was, not about ritual. With Enoch, it was about grasping what God offered. With Noah, it was obedience in spite of what the evidence may say to the contrary. And there's another common theme about faith. It will run counter-cultural. Think of Enoch, Genesis 5. He walks with God when his culture is going the opposite way. With Noah, he built an ark when there was no sign of rain. And he got persecution and jeering and ridicule because of it. So faith, when we act on it, when we're acting on God's word, is going to be countercultural. And it's going to bring persecution and suffering, and maybe even martyrdom with it. But then, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. We could call today's reading the greatest adventure, but it's not all a bed of roses. The life of faith involves sacrifice. God calls Abraham to sacrifice his son. And remember, this son was in Abraham's eyes the way God was going to fulfill his promises. So, hang on, if I sacrifice my son, how's God going to fulfill his promises? A contradiction there. But Abraham trusted in God's power, because to fulfill his promise, however difficult it may seem. So faith is also about being prepared to lose out in this world, so we find joy and reward in the next. Of course, as we read verses 13 to 16, actually, it shouldn't matter to us. Verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. This shouldn't matter to them and to us, because we're strangers and foreigners here. We're passing through this world, if you like. We don't feel at home here. So we're not going to be concerned about success or prosperity in this life. We will put up with opposition and persecution as we look towards that better place, that better country. So what is faith? Well, faith is about looking forward, not looking back. Looking forward to that heavenly home. It's about trusting in God's promises and acting on His word. It's about being prepared to make sacrifices, even those things that are the most important to us. And it will be hard work. So who knows where this greatest adventure will take us, when we're trusting and acting on God's word. But rest assured, it will be our greatest adventure.